What does hope sound like? That was a question that a very dear friend of mine from graduate school, who is a visual artist, asked me, very unexpectedly. It was a question that changed the way I listen. So I ask you the same thing, especially after hearing that last speaker. What does hope sound like? What does community sound like? What does comfort sound like? What does courage sound like? I invite you to listen. One of my most powerful lessons in listening occurred not during my musical training at Yale University School of Music. It was during the second year of my faculty time at the theology school at Emory University, where I was music professor. It happened in a very, very unexpected way that I never, ever in a million years could have asked or imagined. We all went on retreat up to the North Georgia mountains about a week before the students came. And about an hour into the first morning session, the dean of faculty made an announcement that we'd have a visiting professor with us for the next 2 years. And he'd be arriving soon to join us on the retreat. Okay, that was fine. When he said the name of the visiting professor, there was a collective gasp in the room. Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa. The Archbishop had just finished leading South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission's hearings. So he would be spending the fall semester writing his report, and in the next 3 semesters with us teaching about truth and reconciliation. We were all still processing this surprising announcement when about 30 minutes later, the side door opened very quietly and the Archbishop entered, nodding, hello, good morning, and came to the back of the room and took a seat right behind me. A short time later, we had a coffee break. And I noticed over on the side, a couple of senior faculty members were speaking with the Archbishop. So I ventured over to take my coffee and venture over to stand with them and listen to the conversation. The Archbishop was sharing about his experience in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. And for those of you who don't know, and dare I boil it down to this small explanation, it was a time when, in a unique setting, where the victims of apartheid violence were invited to break their silence, to come before the commission and to share their stories and have them heard and witnessed by the commission and also the perpetrators who were present but silent. So after listening to the Archbishop talk about some of his experience and the stories he heard, one of my colleagues who happened to be a pastoral care professor asked him, Archbishop, when the painful stories were so overwhelming, what did you do? None of us knew what he would say. The Archbishop put his cup of tea down on his saucer, and he looked at the 4 of us, and he said, I sang. When my spirit could hold no more, I sang. And he quietly started singing right there, Senzenina, Senzenina. My colleagues nodded. I almost dropped my coffee cup because I knew not just what he sang, I knew the story behind it. The song is Senzenina, means what have we done? What have we done to deserve this? It was one of the most well-known South African liberation songs. When anybody gathered together in an anti-apartheid gathering, they would sing this amongst many other pieces too. So this music, understand, is with music, not at music. It's not sung by one person at an audience. It's started by one and sung by everyone. So when the Archbishop started singing this in the TRC hearings, everyone there joined him and carried what was in that song together. They bore it together. I was very fortunate to have my colleague Leon Starker and his pro cantu, now the Cape Town Youth Choir, allow me to use a little bit of this piece that they recorded. The lead singer, Monde Medingue, will start, and the rest of the ensemble will sing. So imagine if this were happening in the TRC hearings. This story and this music changed me completely. How do we listen? Do we hold space for the stories of others to be heard and to be honored? Do we truly listen for the deeper truths inside those stories? Let me give you an example. Question, what does comfort sound like? 273 years ago this April, one of the most famously unknown benefit concerts occurred with one of the most famous pieces in Western music. You all know the Alleluia Chorus, and some of you who are choral singers will recognize this score from afar. The backstory to Handel's Messiah isn't well known, but let me break the boundary on that for you briefly today. In the summer of 1741, Handel was 56 years old. He received an invitation from the Lord Lieutenant of Dublin, Ireland, to come and do benefit concerts there. So he did. He had a script next to him because he was also invited to bring a new piece if he liked. And obviously that just sparked a flame in him. And he took this new script, and in 24 days, he wrote this score. He went to Dublin. He did series of concerts there, some benefit concerts. They were very well received. So in March and in April, in that time, he and his colleagues decided this was the time that they would premiere this brand new piece as a benefit. Now put on your glasses of that time period for 3 specific charities. One was a home for abandoned babies and homeless children. We might say an orphanage. I think the work went deeper than that. Babies who would have been left on the street and died, children who would have been left on the street to live, try to live. That home. Also, a medical clinic for the poor, and also for relief to men in prison for unpaid minor debts. And a few days before the premiere, this is fascinating. It makes sense when you know the larger story. They sent word out around town for people who were coming to the concert, for men to leave their swords at home and women to leave the hoops out of their skirts at home so they could fit 100 more people in the hall to raise more money. So imagine for a moment that you all are there, that the orchestra is here, it's starting to play. Plays for a few minutes, the tenor soloist steps out, and these are the first words that are sung in this piece by this famous composer for a benefit concert.
Come, for thee,
comfort ye, comfort my people. It's sung not once but 4 times. Handel's intention to me is very, very clear. What does comfort sound like? To him, it sounded like writing a piece of music for an event that would indeed bring comfort to the most vulnerable in his community. That's what comfort sounded like. And it did. They raised about 400 pounds, which I went online to do some conversions of. That would have been $50,000 to bring comfort. And when he returned home to London, he partnered with the same kind of foundling hospital there until he died to do benefit concerts of that score to raise money for the most vulnerable in his community. So what if we carry Handel's story forward? What if we carried his intention forward to 2015, not just to do benefit Messiah concerts as much as we would love to, but what does comfort sound like in your community to the most vulnerable? Are you listening? Would you break the silence of some of those stories and unlock them? Let me give you an example from my own experience. Conductors organize concerts multiple times a year, usually around a theme, sometimes a great masterwork. Sometimes we put concerts for entertainment, for fun. I love to create concerts that unlock a story. So let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, all of us had to figure out what we were going to do to honor the 10th anniversary of 9/11. A lot of organizations paired a requiem with patriotic music. I didn't. Most conductors will go through their library and boxes of scores and start pulling music together and weave them together to come up with a concert. I didn't. I started by asking one question. Where were you on 9/11? I asked friends, I asked family, I even asked some strangers, explained my project and said, where were you on 9/11? I would love to know. And the stories that poured forth were absolutely incredible once that boundary was broken and the silence was broken. I listened. I gathered the stories, and with permission of a couple of them, I wove them together with pieces of music into a concert called Voices of Courage. Let me give you a couple of examples. A Naples pastor, I live in Naples across Alligator Alley. He lived in New York City then. He was working at a church very close to Ground Zero. In our concert, he read his diary entry from September 12th. One of my singers was born in Cuba. She was 14 on that day. She and her mom and her younger sister were sitting in the American office, not an official embassy, in Havana that morning, having their final interview for visas to immigrate to the United States, which was her childhood dream. And all of a sudden the news broke and the office closed and they were told to leave. They did get their visas. They did come to Southwest Florida. And 10 years later, she got to tell that story from her 14-year-old perspective, not only to us, but to her parents who were sitting in the audience that day. Another story I heard when I went to teach at Festival 500 in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. I didn't know about the airplanes crossing the Atlantic. What happened to tens of thousands of passengers? The planes landed in St. John's, in Gander, Newfoundland, and in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Canadians took in tens of thousands of strangers and fed and housed and clothed them until they could get back on the planes and come back to the States. Incredible stories to me of courage and compassion that were unlocked by one question. Where were you on 9/11? And listening for the stories. I have to say, in all of my years being a musician, by far the most powerful concert that was transformative for me and the process of it happened 5 years ago last weekend in Naples. Some local choral friends and I decided to create a new vocal ensemble, and we're wrestling with what our first concert would be. I wanted to partner with a local women's organization to see if there might be a collaborative way of telling a story through our concert. And I discovered that there was a counselor at our local domestic violence shelter for women and children who was working with the women there to heal from PTSD by a healing arts program. They did visual art, drumming, creative writing, yoga, and dance. And so as I gathered and read the stories of survivors, I wove the whole concert together into what I called finding a voice. I had no idea that 1 in 3 women were affected by gender violence. I wrote a concert that reflected the story of a journey of a survivor, from lament to breaking the silence to hope to healing to restoration. The concert used a variety of arts languages. The music we sang, the texts in the music and the stories in the music we sang. We had a dancer, we had spoken narration, and we had visual art. These last couple of slides were in our concert thanks to my photographer and artistic friend, Jen Gray. And we also included, with permission, some of the artwork from the women in the shelter so their voices were present in our concert. I called the concert Finding a Voice so that we honored the women who found their voice and said no to the violence in their lives. I also wanted to encourage and challenge the community to find its voice and say no to this in our community. But I have to tell you, the most transformative part of this project for me was not writing the concert and not presenting it. It happened in incredible moments when I least expected it, and I learned what it meant for someone to have her story honored and heard. I might be at a grocery store, or I might be having lunch somewhere, or I might be down at the beach I can walk to, which was that first slide, to have a cup of coffee at our little coffee bar. And there'd be a woman sitting just down from me, and she'd look over and then look away. And she'd look back and she'd say, "Excuse me, but were you the one who did that concert?" And I would say, "Yes, the Finding a Voice concert." "Yes. Thank you for telling my story." Or, "Thank you for telling my daughter's story." I have to tell you, in my life, I've had few holy ground moments like that. Transformation, given and received. Story honored, silence broken. I leave you with this. Our stories matter because we matter as people. So what does community sound like? What does comfort sound like? What does courage sound like? What does finding one's voice sound like? The answers are there if we listen. If we listen with the intention not to reply, but simply to understand. So I invite you to break the silence, to hold compassionate listening space for the stories around you, to leave today and be transformative listeners. Thank you.